You were never supposed to hear this story, not because it was small, but because it was powerful enough to change how a nation understood war, survival, and the quiet strength of people history almost ignored. Imagine being captured, surrounded by fear, uncertainty, and silence, yet holding on to a courage that even trained soldiers struggled to keep. This is not just another World War story. This is the hidden reality of female prisoners of war whose endurance forced America to rethink strategy, training, and even the meaning of resilience itself. And if stories like this matter to you, take a moment right now to like the video and subscribe to Clandestine Combat, because the stories we uncover here are the ones history tried to bury. In the early years of modern warfare, military planners rarely imagined women standing anywhere near the front lines, let alone inside prison camps controlled by the enemy. Yet war has a way of destroying assumptions. Nurses, medics, resistance, couriers, and intelligence helpers suddenly found themselves captured behind enemy lines, facing conditions designed to break the human spirit. Food was scarce, information was controlled, and hope was treated like contraband. But something unexpected happened inside those camps. Instead of collapse, there was organization. Instead of silence, there was quiet resistance. Women who had never carried weapons began fighting in a different way, protecting morale, sharing secret news, hiding the weak, and turning survival itself into an act of defiance. American commanders studying reports after the war noticed something remarkable. Units connected to rescued female posts often showed stronger psychological recovery than expected. Their testimonies revealed methods of endurance built on cooperation, emotional discipline, and long-term thinking under pressure. These were not traditional battlefield skills, yet they proved just as critical as firepower. Slowly, military doctrine began to shift. Survival training expanded. Psychological resilience became measurable. Support systems inside units were no longer seen as weakness, but as force multipliers. What began in hidden prison barracks was quietly reshaping how America prepared for future conflicts. But the deeper truth was even more unsettling. Strength in war did not always look like aggression. Sometimes it looked like patience, like whispering hope in the dark, like choosing humanity when cruelty was easier. The stories you are about to hear are not comfortable, and they were never meant to be famous. Yet they changed real decisions made in command rooms far from the camps where the suffering happened. And once you understand what these women endured, you may never look at military history the same way again. This is where the untold story truly begins. The first detailed accounts emerged not from headlines, but from quiet debriefing rooms where survivors were asked the same careful questions again and again. What did you eat? How did you communicate? What kept people alive when medicine ran out and rescue felt impossible? Investigators expected stories of suffering alone. Instead, they found systems. Women inside the camps had created routines that stabilized the mind when the body was failing. They organized whispered schedules, shared memories of home as if they were medicine, and protected the most fragile prisoners with a discipline that felt almost military in its precision. Hope was not treated as emotion. It was treated as strategy. One rescued nurse later described how morale could collapse faster than health. A single rumor, a missed meal, or the loss of one prisoner could spread despair through an entire barrack. So they learned to control information the way commanders control supply lines. Bad news was softened. Good news was repeated. Small victories on, extra cup of water, a hidden bandage. A moment of laughter were amplified until they felt larger than the barbed wire surrounding them. Modern survival instructors would later recognize this as psychological leadership under extreme captivity. But inside the camp, it was simply the difference between living and giving up. American military analysts, reviewing these testimonies, began to see patterns they had overlooked for decades. Traditional training focused on endurance of the individual soldier, resist interrogation, escape if possible, survive alone if necessary. But the behavior inside female POW groups revealed something different. Collective survival often outperformed individual toughness. Cooperation reduced panic. Shared responsibility reduced mental collapse. Even physical recovery improved when prisoners believed they were needed by others. These insights would quietly influence future survival, evasion, resistance, and escape programs, reshaping how soldiers were prepared for capture long before the public ever heard the reason why. Yet recognition came slowly, and often without names attached. Many of the women returned home to ordinary lives, carrying memories too heavy to explain to people who only understood victory parades and battlefield heroics. Their impact lived on in training manuals, counseling methods, and command philosophy rather than monuments. History remembered the battles. It almost forgot the barracks where a different kind of war had been fought in silence. And the deeper researchers looked, the more they realized this was not a single story from one conflict. Similar patterns appeared in different wars, different continents, and different generations. Whenever women were captured, the same quiet structures of resistance began to form communication networks. Emotional shielding, shared leadership without rank. It suggested something profound about human survival under pressure, something armies had never fully studied until these hidden experiences forced them to pay attention. What followed would challenge long-held beliefs inside the military itself. As more classified files were opened to read, a clearer picture began to form, one that many officials had once considered too uncomfortable to discuss publicly. The presence of female prisoners of war did more than expose cruelty inside enemy camps. It revealed weaknesses in how America prepared its own people for capture. Training had been built around assumptions shaped by male combat experience, focused on physical endurance, resistance to interrogation, and the lone struggle to survive. But the testimonies coming from rescued women described survival as something more complex, more social, and in many ways, more psychologically advanced than planners had predicted. Inside several camps, prisoners created invisible chains of support that functioned almost like command structures without uniforms. One woman might track the emotional state of others, quietly intervening before despair spread. Another would memorize scraps of information guard routines, supply movements, rumors from new arrivals, turning memory into intelligence. Someone else would ration not just food, but conversation, making sure no one disappeared into silence for too long. These actions were small on the surface, yet together they formed a defense system against mental collapse. Modern military psychologists would later describe this as distributed resilience. But inside the wire, it was simply survival practiced with discipline. What startled American analysts most was how these behaviors affected recovery after liberation. Many expected long-term breakdown, yet groups that maintained strong internal bonds often showed faster emotional stabilization once rescued. Connection had protected identity. Shared purpose had preserved willpower. Even under starvation and fear, the belief that one's suffering mattered to someone else created a psychological shield stronger than isolation. This discovery slowly influenced post-war medical care, pushing the military toward group-based recovery programs instead of purely individual treatment. It was a quiet revolution in how trauma itself was understood. Still, recognition remained uneven. Official reports used careful language, sometimes avoiding direct acknowledgement of how much had been learned from women who were never meant to face combat captivity in the first place. Cultural expectations lagged behind evidence, yet inside training circles, instructors began adjusting scenarios, emphasizing communication, mutual responsibility, and emotional control under pressure. Future soldiers would practice survival methods shaped partly by experiences the public rarely heard about. For the women themselves, the return home was often the most complicated chapter. Freedom did not erase memory. Normal life felt strangely distant after months or years measured by hunger, whispers, and guarded hope. Some spoke quietly about what they endured. Others chose silence, protecting their stories the same way they had protected one another in captivity. But whether spoken or hidden, their experiences were already changing the future of warfare in ways few people could see. And there was one moment recorded in a debriefing transcript that would later be seen as a turning point. The transcript was brief, almost ordinary at first glance, yet the words inside it carried unusual weight. An officer conducting the debrief had asked a simple question meant to measure into what was the hardest part of captivity. The expected answers were hunger, illness, or fear of execution. Instead, the survivor paused and spoke about responsibility. She explained that the most difficult burden was not her own suffering, but the possibility of losing hope in front of the others. If she broke, someone weaker might follow. If despair spread, survival chances for everyone would fall. In that moment, endurance stopped being personal and became collective. For analysts reading the report years later, this single statement challenged decades of military thinking. Strength was no longer defined only by resistance to pain or interrogation. It also meant protecting the morale of others, even when no command structure existed. Emotional control, empathy, and quiet leadership qualities rarely emphasized in traditional combat doctrine were suddenly impossible to ignore. The battlefield had expanded beyond terrain and weapons into the unseen territory of the human mind. Further testimonies confirmed the same pattern. Women in different camps, separated by language and geography, described nearly identical instincts. They hid their worst fears to steady the group. They created rituals to mark the passing of time, so days would not dissolve into hopelessness. They shared stories of the future as if speaking them aloud could keep that future alive. None of this appeared in standard training manuals of the era, yet it was shaping real survival outcomes under the harshest conditions imaginable. Military educators slowly began translating these lessons into structured preparation. Scenarios used in survival schools introduced moral pressure, uncertainty, and the need to support fellow captives rather than endure alone. Psychological resilience started to be measured not just by how long someone could resist, but by how well they could preserve the strength of a group. These changes were subtle, often unnoticed outside specialist circles, but their influence spread quietly through generations of service members. Beyond doctrine, the stories carried a deeper human meaning that statistics could never capture. They revealed that courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is a decision to comfort another person while silently carrying your own fear. Sometimes it is choosing kindness in a place designed to erase it. These acts left no medals, no headlines, yet they reshaped how survival itself was understood. As researchers continued digging through archives, they uncovered another layer of evidence that the impact of these experiences reached far beyond prison camps and into the future of military leadership itself. In leadership seminars held quietly after the war, instructors began presenting case studies that did not come from famous battles or decorated commanders, but from anonymous moments inside captivity. They described how authority can emerge without rank, how trust can become stronger than orders, and how survival sometimes depends on the person who speaks the calmest words rather than the one who gives the loudest command. These discussions were subtle at first, almost cautious, yet they marked the beginning of a deeper shift in how leadership under extreme pressure was understood across parts of the American military. One recurring lesson focused on decision-making when control is nearly gone. Female prisoners often had no weapons, no clear information, and no certainty about rescue. Yet they still made choices every day that shaped the fate of others who received limited medicine, how to respond to guard behavior, when to risk small acts of resistance, and when silence offered the best protection. Analysts noticed that these decisions balanced logic with empathy in a way traditional combat training rarely addressed. It suggested that effective leadership in crisis was not only about dominance or speed, but about judgment shaped by responsibility toward the group. Another discovery involved communication under surveillance. In several camps, prisoners developed coded language through tone, routine phrases, or shared memories that sounded harmless to guards, but carried deeper meaning to those listening closely. Information moved quietly, preserving coordination without attracting punishment. Modern instructors would later connect this behavior to resilience in isolated units and even resistance networks operating behind enemy lines. Once again, lessons born in captivity were influencing preparation for conflicts that had not yet begun. Recovery studies added yet another dimension. Survivors who had taken on supportive roles for others often struggled privately after returning home, not because they were weak, but because constant responsibility had delayed their own emotional release. This realization helped shape counseling approaches that recognized hidden burdens carried by caregivers and informal leaders. The military's understanding of trauma slowly widened, acknowledging that strength during crisis could mask pain that surfaced only in safety. Through all these findings, one truth became increasingly clear. The experiences of female prisoners were not marginal footnotes to history. They were evidence that warfare affects the human mind in ways strategy alone cannot predict. And the more carefully officials studied these quiet acts of endurance, the more they recognized that future conflicts would demand a different kind of preparation, one that valued psychological unity as much as physical power. But the public still knew almost nothing about these transformations, and that silence would last for years. For a long time, the silence was intentional. Governments emerging from global conflict wanted stories of victory, rebuilding, and national strength. Narratives centered on suffering in prison, camps especially. The suffering of women felt complicated, difficult to explain, and politically uncomfortable. So many records remained buried in archives, and countless personal accounts stayed inside private memories. Yet, beneath that quiet surface, the influence of those experiences continued spreading through policy, training, and medical research, shaping the future in ways the public could not yet see. During the early Cold War, planners faced a new fear: capture in conflicts where rescue might never come. Survival could mean months or years of isolation, propaganda pressure, and psychological manipulation. When specialists searched for real-world examples of endurance under those exact conditions, they repeatedly returned to testimonies from former female prisoners of war, not because the suffering was unique, but because the coping strategies were unusually clear, structured, and repeatable. The lessons were no longer historical curiosity. They became preparation for an uncertain future. Training programs slowly evolved. Instead of focusing only on resisting the enemy, instructors began teaching service members how to preserve identity, memory, and trust over long periods of captivity. Small routines, shared responsibility, and controlled emotional expression behaviors once observed quietly inside prison barracks now practiced deliberately in simulated environments. The goal was not just to survive physically, but to return with the mind intact. This shift marked one of the most profound yet least visible changes in modern military preparation. Medical understanding followed a similar path. Doctors studying long-term trauma noticed that connection to others often determined recovery more than the severity of physical hardship. Survivors who had protected or supported fellow prisoners sometimes carried deep exhaustion, yet they also showed remarkable resilience against complete psychological collapse. These findings helped shape group therapy models, peer support systems, and reintegration programs that later benefited thousands of veterans across different wars. Once again, knowledge born in hidden suffering was quietly saving lives in the open world. Still, recognition of where these lessons began remained limited. Official language spoke of observed behaviors and field experiences, rarely naming the women whose endurance provided the evidence. History moved forward, using their strength while leaving their identities in shadow. But stories have a way of resurfacing, especially when new generations begin asking questions older ones were never encouraged to ask. And when those questions finally reached the public, the reaction was not what many officials expected. Instead of indifference, there was fascination. Instead of discomfort, there was profound respect. The story of quiet, disciplined courage resonated deeply. People were drawn to a narrative where strength was measured not by violence, but by the will to preserve humanity in an inhuman place. Their hidden history became a source of national pride, a testament to a different kind of heroism that was finally, after decades of silence, being celebrated. When fragments of these stories slowly reached journalists, historians, and eventually ordinary citizens, the response was a mixture of disbelief and quiet respect. Many people had grown up with a simplified image of war-clear battles, visible heroes, and victory measured by territory gained or lost. The idea that some of the most important lessons came from unarmed prisoners, enduring suffering in silence, challenged that familiar narrative. It forced the public to confront a different kind of courage, one that did not fit easily into medals or parades. Documentaries, memoirs, and declassified interviews began revealing personal moments that statistics could never show. A whispered prayer shared across bunks, a hidden diary written in fragments of pencil, a prisoner giving away her last strength to comfort someone else who was fading faster. These were not dramatic battlefield scenes, yet they carried an emotional gravity that reshaped how many Americans understood sacrifice. War was no longer only about combat. It was also about endurance of the human spirit when every external freedom had been stripped away. Military institutions watched this shift in public awareness carefully. Recognition brought honor, but it also brought responsibility to acknowledge gaps in past preparation and support. Conversations expanded about inclusion, training, and the realities faced by service members beyond traditional combat roles. While policy changes moved slowly, the cultural understanding of strength continued evolving, influenced by stories that had waited decades to be heard. For surviving former prisoners, this attention was deeply personal. Some felt relief that the truth was finally visible. Others struggled with memories returning after years of silence. Yet many shared a common hope that future generations might be better prepared, better protected, and never forced to learn the same lessons through suffering. Their voices, once confined to guarded rooms and classified files, were now shaping discussions about ethics, leadership, and the true cost of conflict. This growing awareness also reached younger service members in training. Recruits who studied survival and resistance no longer saw those subjects as abstract theory. They understood that real people had lived through the scenarios being practiced. The emotional distance between past and present narrowed, creating a deeper respect for resilience in all its forms. But even as recognition expanded, one final question remained: why had these stories stayed hidden for so long? And what did that silence reveal about the way nations remember war itself? The answer was not simple, because silence in history is rarely caused by a single decision. Part of it came from discomfort. Stories of captivity, especially involving women, challenged traditional images of protection and strength that many societies prefer to preserve. Admitting that war had placed them in such danger meant confronting how total and unforgiving modern conflict had truly become. Another part of the silence came from bureaucracy. Records were scattered, classified, or written in language so clinical that the human reality nearly disappeared between the lines. And then there was personal silence. The choice of many survivors to protect their memories rather than relive them for an audience that might never fully understand. Yet silence does not erase impact. Even while the public remained unaware, the lessons drawn from those experiences continued shaping military ethics and planning. Discussions about treatment of prisoners, responsibilities of command, and the psychological welfare of captured personnel gained new urgency. The presence of female post-force policymakers to confront questions they had once avoided. How should dignity be protected in captivity? What support is owed after liberation? And how can preparation reduce suffering before the next conflict begins? These were no longer theoretical debates. They were grounded in lived experience. Historians later noticed something else whenever these stories were finally told. They changed not only military thinking but civilian understanding of resilience. People began to see courage in quieter places. Caregivers, medics, families waiting at home, and anyone enduring hardship without recognition. The boundary between battlefield heroism and everyday strength started to blur. In that sense, the legacy of these women extended far beyond war itself, influencing how society defined endurance, leadership, and compassion under pressure. For younger generations discovering these accounts for the first time, the emotional impact was often immediate. The distance of decades disappeared when faced with personal words written in confinement or spoken in fragile voices years later. History stopped feeling abstract and became human again. And with that realization came a responsibility to remember, to learn, and to carry forward the lessons paid for through suffering. That responsibility is part of why stories like this are shared, where hidden moments of history are brought into the light not for drama, but for understanding. Because once the silence breaks, forgetting is no longer an option. And as the final pieces of this untold story come together, one truth stands above all the others, that in the face of absolute powerlessness, the single greatest act of defiance is to preserve the humanity of another. That truth is simple, yet powerful enough to reshape how we see conflict itself. War is often remembered through victories, strategies, and the names of commanders who moved armies across maps. But the deeper measure of war is found in the people who endured it without control, without recognition, and sometimes without hope. The experiences of female prisoners of war reveal that survival is not defined only by strength of body or force of weapons. It is defined by connection, by purpose, and by the quiet decision to keep going when surrender of the spirit would be easier than resistance. Military thinkers eventually understood that these lessons reached far beyond a single generation. Future conflicts would not always be fast or decisive. Some would be long, uncertain, and psychologically exhausting. Preparing soldiers for that reality required more than equipment or tactics. It required teaching them how to protect their humanity under pressure, how to support one another in isolation, and how to return home with identities still intact. In many ways, the hidden endurance of captured women helped shape that preparation, leaving fingerprints on doctrine that few people ever traced back to its source. There is also a moral dimension that cannot be ignored. When nations study suffering honestly, they gain the chance to reduce it in the future. Policies about prisoner treatment, recovery care, and psychological support grow stronger when built on real stories instead of distant theory. The legacy of these women therefore lives not only in memory, but in protections that may spare others from the same pain. Their endurance became a form of unseen service, continuing long after the camps themselves were gone. For viewers listening today, the importance of this history is not limited to the past. Every generation faces moments of pressure, uncertainty, and fear different from war, yet demanding the same inner resilience. The courage shown in captivity reminds us that strength can exist even in silence, and that supporting others is sometimes the most powerful act a person can choose. These are lessons that cross time, culture, and circumstance. As this story approaches its end, what remains is not just sorrow for what was endured, but respect for what was, preserved hope, dignity, and the refusal to let darkness define the human spirit. And there is one final reflection that brings everything together. That reflection is this: history is shaped not only by those who wield power, but by those who endure it with courage and ingenuity. The female prisoners of war we've followed through this story were never expected to influence military doctrine, to challenge assumptions about survival, or to teach lessons that would ripple decades into the future. Yet they did all of this quietly, behind barbed wire, in dimly lit barracks, with nothing but determination, cooperation, and hope as their tools. Their experiences remind us that heroism does not always appear on the battlefield. Sometimes it exists in whispered plans, shared strength, and the unbroken will to keep living not for oneself alone, but for the group, for the future, and for history itself. For America, the impact was profound. Training programs, survival schools, and psychological preparedness all began integrating lessons derived directly from those women's resilience. Commanders learned that leadership under pressure could emerge from empathy and responsibility, not just rank or force. The military's understanding of captivity, recovery, and mental toughness evolved because of these lessons, forever altering how soldiers were trained to survive extreme conditions. Everyday service members benefit from strategies first observed in those hidden, quiet acts of defiance. And yet, the story of these women is not only about military evolution, it is about human connection, endurance, and dignity. They endured the unendurable, protected each other, and transformed suffering into survival that shaped a nation's approach to war. It's a legacy that history almost ignored, but one that continues to echo through generations. Their courage teaches us that resilience is not measured in medals, but in the quiet strength that refuses to break, even when every external sign says it should. If this story moved you, if it opened a door into a part of history you never knew, make sure to comment below with your thoughts and share this video with others. Let the untold story of female prisoners of war reach as many people as possible. And don't forget, for more hidden moments of history, subscribe to Clandestine Combat, where every episode uncovers the lessons history tried to keep in the shadows. Because the truth is simple, courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers, and those whispers can change the world.